You've reached the Tony Moze podcast, interviewing the most influential people around the globe. He's a former psychology worker and military veteran turned tech professional and entrepreneur with the goal to educate and inspire you to fulfill your dreams. Whether that's transitioning into a new job, increasing skills, or turning your hobbies into a money-making gig, Tony shows that the world is big and opportunities are endless. And now, without further ado, the Tony Moze podcast.
So once again, thank you very much, Michael, for being part of this.
And thank you. It's a terrific book review, Tony. Congratulations. And you're especially reaching, I think, younger audiences as well, which is absolutely critical when it comes to food and health and turning a corner on this whole sort of bad eating diet thing that we're into.
What inspired you into looking at pathogens, and what were the results of these pathogens in peanuts and hamburger meat? Like, what were your experience with that?
Well, it was actually a little bit of self-preservation, just to back up one step. 2008, I was in Algeria writing about Islamic militants, actually. I'd been traveling to Iraq in the Middle East, writing about the war there and the effects that the war was having on the ability of jihadi recruiters to get new members. When I got in some trouble in Algeria, I had to come back to the United States, and my editor at the New York Times spotted this outbreak of salmonella in peanuts being manufactured in a factory in southern Georgia. And I kind of looked at Christine a little quizzically. I think I was pitching her a story about U.S. arms sales overseas, and she goes, "No, Michael, think about it. One, people are eating these peanuts and dying and getting sick from them. Two, they're being processed here in the US of A. We can't blame China or some other far-off place for this problem. And three, they're being used as ingredients by a $1 trillion processed food industry about which we really know very little." And sure enough, when I went to Georgia and poked around, it became this story of that industry losing control over its food chain, being unable to even identify the products where these peanuts were going into. Weeks and weeks were going by, and they were still issuing new recalls, hundreds and hundreds of them for products that had used these peanuts. And I was continuing to write about pathogens. I next went to Minneapolis, Minnesota, write about E. coli in hamburger, people getting very sick from that. When a source of mine in the meat industry said, "Look, Michael, as tragic as these incidents of contamination are, if you really want to look at something that's hurting a whole lot of people, you should look at the things that my industry," he was talking about the meat industry, "is intentionally adding to their products with absolute control over them." He was mostly worried about the huge amounts of salt that goes into processed food and processed meats. But when I looked at salt, I ran across fat and then sugar and realized that those three are the unholy trinity on which this processed food industry relies on to make its stuff, low cost, convenient, and utterly irresistible.
I remember Cargill. It's like this is almost like an underground ring, like a mafia, I don't know. It's creepy. It's scary to me that this is what exists. And like Cargill, I mean, who is Cargill? What are they all about? I mean, and how easy or hard is it for any average Joe to like waltz into Cargill?
Well, Cargill is one of the largest privately held companies in the world, meaning it doesn't need to say very much publicly about its operations. It's not beholden to issue stockholder reports, that sort of thing. I was familiar with Cargill because they had made the hamburger that I wrote about looking at E. coli. Declined to talk to me, but I had come across a ton of documents that sort of put me inside the company as they were making very critical decisions about testing or not testing the meat supply that was going into making the hamburger. So I was actually a little surprised that then they decided to talk to me and let me inside their operation to talk about their dominance of the salt manufacturing field. But I think to sort of, in their view, they saw themselves not as the users of salt and not the company that's putting the vast amount of salt into our diet. Those are the food companies making the products. Cargill was the supplier to those companies. And I think it even prided itself on trying to come up with some versions of salt that still had what they call the flavor burst, that intense sort of effect on the saliva in your mouth and the hit on the taste buds that would send that signal to the reward center of your brain saying, wow, Tony, I love that. Let's have some more. Still providing that, but with less salt per volume as other types. So Cargill may not be kind of the most exposed of the many big food giants that I write about in the book.
Yeah, because they could just pretty much just make the product and just give it to the people who have the face of the public, McDonald's, Kellogg's, Kraft, and they could just wipe their hands clean.
Yeah, and the company's actually making the products because they are, in fact, the ones deciding how much to put in those products. And that's really the problem with salt, Tony, as it is with fat, as it is with sugar. I mean, those three ingredients are part of my diet, your diet. When I cook at home, I don't avoid using them. But there's just no way that, in the kind of cooking that we do, that we can add the huge volumes of salt, sugar, fat to our food at home, like the food companies do, because they're adding it more than just for flavor. I mean, these are miracle ingredients to them. They're adding sugar to replace tomatoes, which are more expensive in ketchup. They're adding salt as a preservative and to mask some of the off notes and flavors. They're slipping processed cheese, which is basically fat, into products to increase the mouthfeel, the allure of processed foods at a sort of very low price. So in the hands of those companies, salt, sugar, fat is a weapon to get us to not just like their products, but to want more and more of them. And that's where the problem lies.
Oof. Now, how often do these companies change their formulas, and what would make them change their formulas?
Pretty constant thing going on at the companies is to change formula, mostly driven by what they call the least cost formulation. They're driving for the lowest sticker price in the grocery store. And so when one ingredient suddenly gets expensive because of a war in Ghana or what have you, they will scramble to try a replacement, to find a replacement, and assign their bench chemists in their factories to come up with a new formula that will enable them to make the product using something else. More recently, what you're seeing, Tony, in response to this increasing concern among people on the East Coast and the West Coast in the heart of the country about what they're putting in their bodies and concern about processed foods, you're now seeing these companies scramble to simplify their ingredients, to cut out, the most problematic among them, or at least cut down. And so now there's this big reformulation going on to cut back on salt, sugar, fat, to remove artificial dyes and colorings, to naturalize the processed food in the grocery store, if you will.
I didn't know if it was a cultural thing, but are the amounts of salt, sugar, and fats that are put in products consistent worldwide? Could I eat Doritos in Spain and expect to have the same bliss points and mouthfeels as I would in Australia or United States?
There's actually a little bit of change from country to country. One of the old-time inventors at the company called General Foods once was testing Tang in China, and as he moved south in the country, he noticed that people's liking of sweetness increased. And so in that case, it's just a matter of spooning more of those delectable crystals into the glass of water and getting a sweeter tang effect. You'll see a little bit of that in countries. Mostly, though, what you're seeing now is the spread of American-style processed foods throughout the world as these American, which are really now multinational corporations, are marketing heavily to countries that really weren't as dependent on processed foods as we are. It's a wide open market to them. So emerging middle-class markets in Brazil are now the target of the processed food industry, but also the heart of Europe, the heart of culinary Mecca, Italy and France. You're now seeing fast food restaurants and fast food American-style products in grocery stores pop up everywhere. And with that, Tony, you're seeing a rise in obesity, a rise in diabetes, a rise in all of these sort of health-associated problems that come along with a bad diet.
Like, are taste preferences specific by race? Meaning, does one race have a preference of one type of ingredient over the other? And how about sex or gender?
Not that I know of in terms of race. The biggest difference, or at least I never ran across sort of the companies targeting their formulations by race. The really big difference, though, is with kids.
Okay.
I was lucky to meet and write about a legend in the industry named Howard Moskowitz. He's responsible for many of the biggest icons in the grocery store. He was trained in experimental psychology at Harvard, practices what he calls food engineering to create new markets. He coined the term the bliss point to describe the perfect amount of sweetness in a product that would send us over the moon. Not too little, not too much. And that bliss point for sweetness for kids is much, much higher than adults. Kids are born hardwired for sweet taste, and you lose that gradually over time. And the problem isn't that the companies have engineered bliss points for things like soda or ice cream or cookies, things we expect to be sweet. The problem when you talk to nutritionists is that the companies have marched around the grocery store adding sugar to things that didn't used to be sweet before. So now bread has added sugar and a bliss point for sweetness. Yogurts can have almost as much sugar in them per serving as ice cream. Pasta sauces can have the equivalent of a couple of Oreo cookies in a tiny half-cup serving. And what this does is create this expectation that everything we eat should be sweet, which is a real problem when you drag your kids over to the produce aisle and try to get them to eat some of that stuff we should all be eating more of, right? The broccoli and the Brussels sprouts, things that might have a little bitter notes or sourness. You're going to have rebellion on your hands, and that's what happens in so many houses.
I even go to restaurants, and the cooks there intentionally put salt or sugar extra as their flavor enhancer instead of other world, more broad herbs and spices. And it's crazy because I see it from a couple standpoints. Of course, from the business standpoint, it's cheap, it's cost effective.
Right.
And somehow, some way the mind is closed. Oh, this is even better than something that had no salt or sugar. Mm-hmm. So it's just crazy how that's affecting even like restaurants. You have the restaurants where you would assume they would at least cook more home style, where it would be less of the cheap manufactured, engineered sugars, salts, and fats. And I think that's also permeating into the homes as well.
Yes, no, absolutely. There's no question that the grocery manufacturers and the restaurateurs, certainly the less conscientious among them, the less skillful, trade tricks back and forth. You kind of see both parts of the industry kind of infusing each other with ways to cut corners, ways to cut costs that inevitably sort of increase our dependence on salt, sugar, fat.
Are you enjoying this episode? Please give a like, comment, follow, or subscribe. And now back to the Tony Moze Podcast.
So do you believe that in the future our taste buds will change to the point that they will have to increase the bliss points or mouthfeels? What can we speculate on, like, human beings' taste buds in the next 25 years? What could we just... do you think that it would just have to up the ante? People are just going to want more, like a heroin or crack fix?
I don't think it's increasing the bliss point. What the real question is sort of, are we at a point now where we're turning the corner and gaining control over processed foods? I think that's true for a lot of people. There was this delicious moment early last year, Tony, when representatives of the biggest companies all went down to an investor conference in Florida reporting dismal profit earnings, and the more forthright among them confessed that the reason was they were losing the trust of their consumers who wanted to eat healthier and no longer had confidence in these big companies to provide them with the products that would make them and their families healthy. So that's one reason these companies are scrambling now. Whether we can sort of continue to sort of translate that concern into purchase habits is the real kind of question going forward, because it's hard. I mean, we've developed a really ingrained, deep habit liking for these products, for the convenience, for the taste, for the salt, sugar, fat, and that takes time to change. But there's huge hope. I mean, look, take salt. I mean, anybody who's been on a low salt diet under doctor's orders because of concerns about its connection to high blood pressure, heart disease, knows that if you cut back intentionally on eating salt, which means basically eliminating 90% of the products in the grocery store, which are so hugely salty, right? You do that for 6 weeks, and you can't even go shopping at the grocery store anymore outside of the produce aisle. Everything will taste so salty. The entire country of England did this recently, and Londoners started joking that when they went to Paris, they couldn't stand the food because it was so salty. They had sort of collectively brought down their bliss point for salt. So one of the things that really surprised me at the book is that I think the companies are actually more dependent on salt, sugar, fat than we are, and that we're going to be, it's going to be easier for us to get unhooked on these gobs amounts than the companies themselves.
Yeah, it's amazing. Michael, I brought the culprits here today. A couple of listeners. Now, where did I get these from? I work, of course, part-time with children and adolescents in a psychiatric hospital.
Oh, boy.
A hospital which would inherently promote health, right? However, when you walk into the kitchen, you could see these and many others like Rice Krispies treats, Frito-Lays, the whole gamut, white bread, toppling. I mean, seriously, like it's just overflowing.
Yeah.
Like seriously, you could open up. It's almost like a cartoon where you open up the closet and out pours this avalanche of this stuff, guys. Frosted Flakes, Fruit Loops, Oreos, and many more of these things. And like, I wanted to ask, first off, what do you think? What's the shelf life on these? I mean, people say, don't worry, since it's processed, it's gonna stay. You could eat it 20 years from now. But I mean, what is the shelf life on this?
Years, months in some cases, but years in other cases. That's one of the reasons why the industry is so hooked on salt, sugar, fat, is that the way that the distribution system is set up, they've got to park that stuff, in warehouses, at the factory, in this case, in a hospital, storeroom for weeks and weeks and months and not have it deteriorate. And so that's what you get. Hospitals is a huge, huge area where people are working really hard to make improvements. I gave a talk recently in Kansas where the Hospital Association is trying to improve the food that they're serving to people after they save their lives in the emergency room, because there's this feeling among doctors that we're saving them there and we're killing them with the food, and we're missing this huge opportunity to help people create some new eating habits, because food is such a fundamental part of good health. But it's so difficult because the entire system is hard. You go to a place like Kansas, and most of the agriculture involves growing field corn, not the kind you eat, field corn that's used for cattle feed, ethanol, high fructose corn syrup. And so they have to import the kind of corn you want to eat or the vegetables, and you end up with much of the state being an incredible food desert where people are driving 100, 150 miles just to get to a supermarket and hope that there's some produce there.
Crazy. What are your thoughts on iodized salt versus sea salt? Because I mean, I get a little hazy. If I see it in the middle section of the supermarket, or if I just see it in the supermarket, I'm automatically saying I don't know if I could trust this, but like, what is your take on that? Iodized, the regular Morton salt versus the sea salt. And I put quote unquotes because I don't know. What's your take on that?
I think some of the finer sea salts out there that you'll pay big bucks for, have a certain taste that if you have a palate for that, may make it worthwhile. Iodized mean it has iodine, infused in it, which was an important issue years ago when there was an iodine deficiency in the country. But basically, Tony, salt is salt. And by the way, sugar is pretty much sugar too. Whether you're talking about table sugar, high fructose corn syrup, I could go on and on. Some of the euphemisms, evaporated cane juice sugar, which some companies are going to talk about. In terms of calories, there may be some distinction in the way that the body metabolizes it. The science is still out on that. But in terms of calories and weight gain issues so far, sugar.
Okay. What is your stance on the food giants and they're labeling their products as GMO or organic? I laugh at that because it says GMO organic. But I don't know. Some people go, no, but it says organic. What is your take on that? I walk with
Right. So the tricky part about organic is that it's a very narrow term. If you're lucky, it's not always the case, but if you're lucky, you buy something organic, it means that the farmer used somewhat lesser amounts of pesticides to grow the crops that went into that product, right? And that means probably healthier farm workers, less pollution in the water, lots of good things from that, right? But it is irrelevant to kind of the nutritional profile of that product. An organic can of soup can still have the equivalent of a day and a half's worth of salt in that soup, and who knows how much sugar and how much fat. So you can't extrapolate from the word organic to mean that product is actually healthy for you in a broader sense. GMOs, I'm still kind of in the camp where I want to know what's in my product. I haven't made up my mind about GMOs, but I do like this move by companies like General Mills recently and Campbell's Soup to start labeling their products. That, hey, if you're concerned about GMOs, we're going to tell you it's in our product and you can make up your own mind.
Wow. So sometimes I feel like King Leonidas in the movie 300, where I feel like I'm battling every day the trillion man, or you call it the $1 trillion food army. From morning to night, I am bombarded with these images. Seriously, and the audios, going out and, you could take a walk anywhere and you'll see on billboards, on buses, on taxis. And I don't watch TV, but hey, it's still getting me on social media. Yeah. So, buy these Oreo cookies, eat these Lay's potato chips, et cetera, et cetera. I've been moving away from the victim mentality because this is the one area I can't seem to wrap my head around. So the question I ask is, should we blame the food industry for our addiction to salt, sugar, fat, or is it us to blame?
Well, they are the ones doing that marketing, by the way. So that certainly falls well into their camp. And there's no question that seems to be a day in the 1980s when suddenly overnight it became socially acceptable to eat anything, anywhere, anytime. That's when you started seeing people walking down the street eating 2,000 calories in the blink of an eye, or bringing food into business meetings. And that's also when parents stopped saying to their kids, don't snack between meals. The French think we're absolutely insane to snack the way. Why would you ruin one of the most beautiful events of the day, which is sitting down at the table with your friends or family and having a luscious meal? Anyway, don't get me started on that. So I think that, yes, to some extent we can blame ourselves for that, but no question that my food giants took full advantage of that and started creating products that led to kind of what I like to call sort of mindless eating. The yogurt in a little plastic pouch, incredibly sweet, that you can suck out with one hand while you're doing something else, not paying attention to it. And that, no doubt, is one of the big factors that led to the relentless sort of climb in weight and obesity in this country.
Wow. now I want to look at these executives. It's so, I don't know if there's any irony to it, but what is on their plates of the big giants from Kraft and Kellogg's? What are they eating on their day to day? Like, what are they having to eat? While they feed the rest of America, what are they eating when they're back home or when they're amongst their colleagues and business people?
Right. So 2 surprises in the research reporting. One was how, as I mentioned, how dependent the companies are themselves on those 3 ingredients. But 2 is that, their executives, their marketing people, their bench chemists, the people who design these foods, don't eat those products themselves. In many cases, they know better. They know that they're among the many of us who will come home from work in the evening and open up a bag of potato chips and not be able to stop until they eat the entire bag. And so their method for dealing with that is to just avoid them altogether. They have higher incomes. They may typically have a spouse who doesn't have to work outside of the house, who can make real meals for the family. And so they are by nature less dependent than we are on them.
What have you been doing with children, or for children specifically?
Well, first, I like to think that the book was in part written for kids, and so I in fact, one of the most rewarding things is going to schools and talking to kids, in many cases who've made the book a project for their class. There was a school in Rochester that spent the entire year kind of thinking about food and its effects on their lives. And they did fantastic stuff like reformulate their favorite products to make them healthier for them, but still tasty, and think about their favorite products in a new way. And that's one of the things I'm hoping that the book does for kids and adults is actually empower people to walk in the grocery store and feel able to make better decisions about what to buy. And that really resonates with kids as well as adults.
Yeah. I mean, it's bad because when there's a child looking up to the parent, who they see as their role model or whatever, and they see that their role model is engaging in these habits, what else they have to do but copy?
Boy, if I was king for a day, I put a garden in every school. A garden in every hospital, too, for that matter, right? To get the kids excited, right? They bring that excitement home to the parents, and then I would work as hard as I could to make healthy food, vegetables and fruits and basic staples that you can bring home and cook very simply for your family, available to everybody in their neighborhoods without a lot of work. But I think kids are going to be the big driver of the change going forward, because it's so much easier to create good eating habits as opposed to fix bad ones.
Do you have any upcoming books or project that you're working on that you could give us a little info about?
Yeah, I do. Almost in every interview, I got asked the question, just how addictive is this stuff? And so I've spent the last year and a half on the next book for Random House. It's called Hooked: Food and Free Will. It's out, and it's got some really big surprises about that question about just how addictive is this stuff.
If you enjoyed this episode, remember to like, comment, follow, or subscribe. And for more information, be sure to check out the description. Thank you for tuning in, and hope to see you again for the next episodes of the Tony Moze Podcast.